Um, I'm going to talk about the losers, and it's quite apt that I was asked to talk about losers. Now that I actually know anything about the Lib Dems, it was like, oh, the losers, let's get Shane to talk about them. There's a serious point here, though, which is that the Lib Dems are losers. This is not an English-British phenomenon. We experience in most Western European countries today a phenomenon called the electoral costs of governing. Political parties, you have all learned, probably if you're political science students, want to be elected to parliament and want to enter government. The phenomenon today that most political parties in most European countries face is that the actual activity of governing comes at a cost at the subsequent general election. What we learned in the British general election, and actually in most European general elections, however, when it involves two or more parties governing, is that there is not an equal cost of governing between the parties in a coalition government. What we observed last week is something we observe comparatively. Smaller parties in government tend to be disproportionately challenged at the subsequent election. They are a focus of negative media attention during the period of government, and voters tend to punish them more at the general election. Now, we as political scientists, we don't have clear theories as to why this is the case. It may be the case that if you vote for a small party, you are more ideologically tied to that party's policy. And as a small party, that party has to compromise more when they're actually in government. So they have to shift their policy position more so compared to the larger parties in government. But regardless, what we observed last week is not just a British phenomenon. The costs of governing are targeted heavily towards small parties. The question therefore arises, why would any small party choose to enter government? And it's a question that lots of party leaders, particularly Green parties in Europe, have been asking for some decades now. They get crucified at elections. So, as a party leader, it's a very challenging situation. So that's the first point, the electoral costs of governing. Even in economies where everything is going okay, take the Scandinavian countries, take Norway, for example. Even there, participating in government as a small party comes at a huge electoral cost. Will the Lib Dems come back? Well, the comparative evidence seems to suggest that that is the case. They bounce back after a period or two periods of not being in government. Now, the only problem in the British case is that the Lib Dems have tended to rely on something that most people don't think exists, but we know it exists, this thing called the personal vote. Lib Dem MPs have tended historically to build a reputation with their constituents, to build this personal relationship which helps them when it comes to an election. To continue that relationship, you have to be an MP, you have to be an incumbent MP. So it will probably be much more difficult for the Lib Dems to come back electorally than for other small parties in Europe. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that this was a depressing weekend for me. Everybody, or most people at least, not particularly everybody, had expected a hung parliament. Everybody was excited. I study parliaments. That's what I do. The prospect of a hung parliament was fascinating for me. Yes, I'm a sad individual, but nevertheless, there you go. Perhaps, well, you're not sad, you're here. So that's, I was going to make a terrible joke, but I won't. Now, why was a hung parliament in 2015 so interesting? Well, under the British Constitution, admittedly an unwritten constitution, the rules of government formation were pretty clear. A government was formed when the outgoing Prime Minister suggested to the monarch that a new Prime Minister could maintain the confidence of the House of Commons. That confidence historically has been tested in the form of a vote on the Queen's speech, usually 1 or 2 weeks after Parliament has reconvened following a general election. In 2011, in their wisdom, the Liberal Democratic Party with the Conservatives introduced and enacted a Fixed Term Parliament Act. And the Fixed Term Parliament Act changed fundamentally the role of Parliament in making and breaking the government. So it specified clearly for the first time ever what constituted a vote of confidence. And it failed to specify that the Queen's speech was a test of the confidence of the government. So constitutionally, we were literally in uncharted waters as the House of Commons falls down. Now, had a hung parliament emerged, what would have happened would have been a guessing game. constitutional lawyers maintained that the Queen's speech was a government formation speech. The government had to pass that speech. More scholars focused on the 2011 Act said that's no longer the case. So that's why many of us were very upset, not because we got a Conservative government, because we didn't get to test the constitutionality of the Queen's speech. But I will suggest that that is something that actually has to be fixed before the next government. Whether or not we have a hung parliament next time remains to be seen. Thank you.